everyone, and you're all very welcome to today's Client Experience Programme session on the Metaverse. It's really lovely to see some cameras on today, so I would say to you, if your environment allows, we'd love to see some faces. I see some already coming on, which is lovely. Get involved, get the most from this session, ask questions, pop them in the chat as we work through today's webinar. As you know, the focus of this series is providing you all with practical insights on the issues that matter most to you. That's not just the ones that are on the top of your priority list, but also the ones that are on the more medium to longer term horizon. And that couldn't be more true in terms of today's session on the Metaverse. The Metaverse, as you know, is never far from the headlines. We've all been reading about technology sector job losses over the last number of weeks, but equally we've seen a steady stream of brands investing in this space. To help you work through the challenges of the Metaverse, both the legal risks involved and also the opportunities for you and your teams, I'm excited and delighted to welcome Anna Koopman, Intellectual Property Partner at Dentons, who's going to work through this challenge with you today. Before we do that, and as always, we'd love to get your views and input on what exactly you're thinking when it comes to the Metaverse. We're going to do a little poll first, so let me just pop this up for everybody. So what we're keen to understand at the start of this session is which of the following most closely reflects your current thinking on the Metaverse. So is it something that you see as for the future? Maybe you're thinking that now is a really good time to start preparing for this. You might be thinking, I'm not sure really what to call it at the moment. Maybe you're like me and you're still a little bit cynical, but you're very interested, so you're open to hearing what it's about. Or even more to the right, you really think it's all hype and you're just coming today because you're curious. So we'd love to understand what you're thinking about the Metaverse in terms of those different perspectives. I can see lots of people getting involved, so we'll do the countdown as usual. We always see a little bit of rush towards the end as the final votes come in. So let's do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 on this one. Great. And a few final voters. Excellent. And now let's have a look at the results. Okay, so I'm sure Anna is dying to comment on some of these. A split on the votes today, so pretty evenly split between now is the time to start preparing. So in that context, you're very welcome to the call today. And then others where they're a little more in my camp around, not sure what to currently call it, a little bit cynical, but very open. And then we have a few who really are not convinced at this point. So there's a challenge for you, Anna, in terms of this one. Okay, so secondly, so let's move to our second poll then. Okay, so this one is a little bit different. Now we're thinking about your organization. So is your business currently utilizing the Metaverse or planning to in the near term? Again, let's do a quick indicator here of how people are thinking and what's the organizational perspective on this one. Okay, so lots of votes coming in, so great to see the engagement before we start the session. It just gives us a really good perspective on where the group is at today. So let's do our countdown again. I'm putting the pressure on for the votes again. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 on this one. Okay, great. Let's end and share. So again, not currently using is the 53% not currently using, but we also have a good chunk, so just under 20%, so 16% who are actually using and planning for it actively. So that's very interesting in terms of today's session. Super. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Anna to take you through today's session.
Thanks, Neve. Hello, everybody. I'm Anna Koopman. I head up the IP team at Dentons UK, and I'm talking to you today about the Metaverse. Now, I'm going to start off by talking about what is the Metaverse, which isn't usually necessary for most topics that I give presentations on, but I think very much the case here. And then we're going to go on to talk about some of the terminology involved with the Metaverse and the building blocks of it and the infrastructure and sort of the nitty-gritty of how it works. We're then going to spend some time talking about the impact that the metaverse is having and is predicted to have on different market sectors. And then the kind of final bit, maybe the important bit for you guys, is what should in-house legal teams be thinking about and preparing for in terms of the metaverse. And I think I'm very happy that we've got a wide range of viewpoints on the metaverse joining me today. I myself am all over the place with different views too. It's definitely a very new thing, so we can explore it together. So turning to defining the metaverse, I've obviously had a go on this slide at a definition that sort of gives an attempt to define what the metaverse is, but actually defining the metaverse isn't an easy feat, and I think it's quite an ambiguous and hypothetical term in a sense. And I think if I asked all of you what you would define the metaverse as, we would get some very different answers, not necessarily wrong ones, just very, very different answers. So that's not because any of them will be wrong. It's because that the metaverse is so rapidly evolving that it could be many things. And some people have suggested that talking about the metaverse now is a bit like computer scientists talking about the internet in the 1960s. And whilst that might give the metaverse more credit than it's worth in the massive effect that it might have on us, who knows? It's certainly true that it's developing at a fast pace. That said, it's not a totally new concept, and efforts at building something like a metaverse have been around for decades. Some of you, including myself, will be old enough to remember Second Life in 2003, which was the idea that you would have a second life in an online world and sort of live as a second life as a person in that online world. And it's not far away from that in a sense, and we'll go on to say how it sort of moved on a bit from that. Other people use the definition of Web 3.0 as being sort of quite similar to what the metaverse will be. The term Web 3.0 is sort of the transition from Web 1.0, which was when we very, very first started using the internet, and we're basically just subsuming content. Web 2.0 is sort of how we would see things now, in terms of both subsuming content, but also sharing content and creating content for the internet. Web 3.0, the idea of it is sort of disintermediation, so the removal of intermediaries and decentralization to give users the opportunity to work directly with each other without the engagement of sort of central platforms and so on. The general consensus, though, is that the metaverse is pretty much something around converging real and virtual worlds and migrating the human experience, whatever that may be, in some sense, into a virtual world. Turning to look at some of the building blocks and the main concepts involved with the metaverse. So clearly, virtual reality, AR, and so on are a big feature of the metaverse, and certainly sort of synonymous with it in some people's eyes. And we'll go on to talk a little bit about what those are in more detail. It is worth mentioning, though, that technically you don't have to access the metaverse via those things. And I mean, the game Fortnite, for example, has aspects that it calls the metaverse of its platform, which can be accessed by phones and PCs, should you wish to be old school about it. So again, that's that sort of strike vagueness on what the metaverse actually is. I think a key feature of the metaverse, though, and to my mind just as fundamental and as virtual reality and AR and so on, is interoperability. And what we mean by that is the ability for users to move their avatars, their identities, and the digital assets they may have acquired in the metaverse from one corner of it to another, and from one platform and application to another. So the idea is you will remain the same virtual person across all the different platforms and have your same identity and your same assets to your name, just as you would in the real world. And obviously that's not really the case right now on the internet, in that you have a different identity with each platform that you engage with, and depending on data sharing, each doesn't really know about what you're doing with the others. Now, to enable the interoperability of the metaverse, blockchain technology is crucial, and we'll come on to talk about that a bit more. But Before we move on to some more concepts and definitions, just some statistics for you on the next slide, which are sort of aimed sneakily at holding your attention and bearing with me as to why this might be worth listening to. Some pretty impressive statistics on both the amount that is predicted to be generated by some quite reputable economic analysts, and also what is already being invested. We've got $5 trillion predicted value generated by 2030. $120 billion have been invested in the first 5 months of this year alone. 1.9 billion of land sold, virtual land sold in the metaverse. I don't know if any of you have got your field yet. I haven't. 11 million XR headsets shipped, and 47.6% CAGR predicted from 2022 to 2030. So some pretty, big predictions there, and people investing quite heavily within it, as you've probably seen in the news. Moving to the next slide, and we're going to get a bit more nitty-gritty on things. So how does it work? So we've discussed what it is conceptually. There's definitely some sort of building blocks that are quite crucial to the whole thing. So just to whiz through a few of those. We talked about Web 3.0 as the sort of the concept that it's removing the intermediaries that we're familiar with at the moment in the way that the internet works, and allowing you to port your identity and assets around the internet just as you do in the real world. XR is basically, as probably most of you know, an umbrella term for the different types of technology that alter reality. So augmented reality, AR, the best example of, or an easy example of that, is wearing glasses in the real world, that digital glasses that when you look at things, it will give you information about what you see around you, such as where you can buy it, probably being the most obvious one. Mixed reality is similar, but it's adding digital elements to the real world. And a good example of that would be if you have a digital pet in the corner of your office right now that would respond to you calling its name, and so on. Virtual reality, which is the one that I think is most commonly associated with the metaverse, is the creation of a fully immersive virtual environment which sort of blocks out the real world and creates a virtual one. And obviously VR headsets, which are increasingly popular, as we saw on the previous slide, are the access point to that. Let's get a bit more techie now. So distributed ledger technology. Now, a blockchain, as many of you may know, but we're going to go through it briefly, is a digital ledger, or it's sort of an encrypted block of digital data that's stored and chained together and is about something. So the idea is that it forms a chronological and single source of truth for a particular set of data, and it gets updated automatically when certain things happen. And so the technology, digital ledger technology, refers to the protocols and the infrastructure that allows computers in different locations to propose and validate transactions with each other and update their records in a synchronized way, update their blockchains and ledgers in a synchronized way. And that technology has sort of proved the stepping stone to create what might be the real metaverse, in that it solved quite a lot of the long-standing issues around transactions and asset ownership within the metaverse. Similarly, smart contracts are pretty crucial too, because those are based on this DLT, the digital ledger technology, and they're used in the metaverse to automate operations and ensure that transactions are done according to predetermined rules. So the idea is that a contract can be automatically executed if certain predetermined conditions are met, which I'm sure feels like many of you in the room with dread. It certainly does me. But typically that means that something can happen automatically and an intermediary doesn't need to be involved, with that same kind of theme again. And that could be a contract and sort of releasing funds or something to a party and selling something, but it could also be registering a vehicle, issuing a ticket, sending a notification. And then the blockchain relating to that sort of concept is then automatically updated when the transaction is completed. Now, we've managed quite a way into the talk, nearly 20 minutes, without talking about NFTs, but I am going to now use that phrase. Obviously, they are very connected with the metaverse, as you know. NFTs, or non-fungible tokens, are essentially a unit of information recorded on the blockchain about a particular good or service. So the typical way that we're seeing them work at the moment is that they can be sort of attached, in a sense, to a particular unique piece of artwork or content, and then used to trade that artwork or content in a reliable way using the blockchain technology that we spoke about. And they can also embed the smart contract so that, for example, when an asset changes ownership, an automatic payment is paid to an artist who's entitled to a royalty, for example, without any intermediaries or sort of need for negotiation. So I think that they have proved popular, of course, because they are something that can be used to represent a virtual thing that you can't see or touch in the real world. But also they give some sort of level of certification to the ownership of that thing, which I think we all seek in terms of how we see ownership of assets working. We will come on to what having an NFT actually means and whether you do actually own anything by having an NFT. But I think that's why they've sort of been taken on so well, and so much as money has been invested in them by certain people. Digital art represented by NFTs, it can be sort of owned in some sense, but also that art can be visually accessed within the metaverse. So there are virtual museums, for example, in many of the platforms that operate within the metaverse, where you can see art that might be owned by someone else in the same way that you would in the real world. AI, before we move off this slide, artificial intelligence is obviously very important too. And deep learning-based software is going to be necessary to essentially power the metaverse, because AI is going to be needed to understand words and images and videos and texts, and to respond accordingly. And in fact, many of the images and animations and artwork and so on might even be created by AI. And AI is going to be needed to automate the smart contracts. So it's pretty key, and it also underpins a lot of stuff. Okay, hopefully you're bearing with me. We've gone through most of the key topics now, so that's good. Let's have an overview of the market. Lots of names that I'm sure you've heard about in the press already as to who the key players are. Meta obviously being a massive one, but also Tencent Holdings, ByteDance, NetEase, Nvidia, Epic Games, Roblox, Unity Technology, Lilith Games, Sandbox, Decentraland, Microsoft, are sort of some of the people that are either investing a lot in or operating themselves platforms that are pretty key at the moment at this early stage of the metaverse. In terms of recent developments, in October 2022, Microsoft, so just literally last month, Microsoft announced a new partnership with Meta, I don't know if you saw this, to bring its range of Microsoft Office products into Meta's VR platform. So an obvious bid there to lure companies like the ones we all work for into working in the metaverse space, and query whether your business is giving any thought to that at this point. Also, earlier this year, Microsoft announced its intention to acquire Activision Blizzard for $68 billion. That's currently under competition review, and that's sort of a theme of some of the acquisitions we're seeing in this concern that many jurisdictions have in not allowing the big players to monopolize the metaverse at this early stage. In January, Sandbox announced a partnership with Warner Music, which I think is quite interesting, to launch the first music-themed world in the Sandbox. In November last year, so about a year ago, Tencent partnered with the Asian Institute of Digital Finance for companies to collaborate in areas of education, research, and entrepreneurship. In November 2021, Epic Games acquired Harmonix Music. And in October last year, Facebook Reality Labs, so that limb of Meta, is estimated to have spent at least 10 billion on developing AR and VR hardware and software. So lots of sort of big moves and big acquisitions in the space, and money spent, but still by a relatively small cast of people. Let's move on to regulation. We are lawyers after all. So now I think the fair way of summarizing this is that most of the big countries are grappling with what regulation of the metaverse should look like, unsurprisingly. Most of them have committees or bills or draft legislation in play in some sense that will have a go at dealing with some of the issues presented by the metaverse in a particularly direct way. Of course, many of our existing laws will have application there too, and we'll come on to talk about that. But in terms of specific regulations, just to whiz through some of the big countries, I'm including the UK in that, even though I'm not sure we make the cut on that anymore. So the metaverse in the UK, the UK government has a draft online safety bill, which is, among other things, going to cover the metaverse in some sense. It's only draft legislation. It's proving quite contentious for many reasons in our government at the moment. But the academics that have drafted that bill have essentially been very open actually, and said that we are not allowing Meta to simply move the problems of the internet, like online safety and so on, into a different space and avoid regulation. So we're going to close that loop by this online safety bill if it exists in the first place. And our Law Commission has launched a review to address some of the difficulties faced by the metaverse, not least the challenges in conflict of laws in terms of which laws should apply, which jurisdictions should apply, which courts hear disputes in the new metaverse land, where some of those things are going to be very difficult. Let's look at the EU. The EU's Commissioner Thierry Breton published a paper just, I think, a couple of months ago now, called People, Technologies and Infrastructure, Europe's Plan to Thrive in the Metaverse. Quite a balanced paper. He, on the one hand, suggests that Europe already has the legislation needed that is strong and future-proof to deal with the metaverse, like the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. But the Commissioner also clearly indicates that there is further work required, and he has formed a virtual and augmented reality industrial coalition to bring together key players, essentially, to develop a roadmap for future development. And he too, like the UK, has stressed that safety, online safety and anti-competitive practices and so on are going to have to be addressed in the metaverse just as they are in the real world. And on that theme, in the US, the most direct regulatory statement on the metaverse that we've had was the FTC's lawsuit to block Meta's acquisition, which, sorry, my screen's just got a bit funny. Yes, to block an acquisition of Within Unlimited, which was fairly recently. And they gave some pretty clear statements that they're not going to allow Meta to, who obviously own most of the platforms we know and love, and also a huge provider of VR devices already and apps and so on. They're not going to allow them to create sort of a dominant position within the metaverse without a bit of a fight. Also, South Korea, a member of the National Assembly in South Korea put forth a proposal to enact a specific Metaverse Act with the specific aim of promoting and supporting the Metaverse. That's got a lot of traction. There's now a Metaverse Policy Review Committee in South Korea that reports directly to the Prime Minister, who's tasked with deliberating policies to promote the Metaverse. Similarly, Japan is welcoming the metaverse with quite open arms, and has been quite open about the fact that it doesn't want to over-regulate the space to discourage Web 3.0 entrepreneurs from operating there. On the other hand, China prohibits NFTs to be issued and traded. The concern that they would be a de facto cryptocurrency, which is not permitted. That said, though, Chinese NFTs platforms have simply changed their names to digital collectibles platforms around this time last year to avoid the regulation. They have imposed quite strict criteria on not selling the NFTs for profits and so on. And earlier this year, over the summer, about 30 of the big players in this field, so Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, all got together and gave a self-disciplined development proposal for the sector to sort of suggest that it should be self-regulated and there should be licenses required to operate in that space, which will be quite expensive and difficult to obtain unless you are one of the big players, unsurprisingly. So quite a lot of action in the governments around the world on metaverse, but nothing tangible just yet. Let's start to think on the next slide about the impact on market sectors and so on. Now, just a quote here for you to take a look at. So we're going to go through some of the different sectors and the impact it's having so far, but I think we're starting here with the pharma industry, and I think it's fair to say that there's some quite high hopes for the transformational impact that the metaverse is going to have on the pharma industry. So on the next slide, life sciences slide, I think that the view is that augmented reality is a possible game changer applied across the value chain, including clinical trials, manufacturing, sales and marketing, and 80% of biopharma executives say that AR will disrupt their industry in the next 3 years. I think the view is that blockchain and NFTs can revolutionize the industry and solve traditional supply chain and manufacturing problems, new marketing opportunities for new drugs. A big discussion area that I find quite interesting is the one around the monetization of health data. So there's big plans for incentivizing patients to sell their information in the metaverse. The idea being that biopharma companies could then buy information that's tailored to their needs, save money on buying dummy data, and therefore develop more accurate drugs more quickly and get them to market more quickly. NFTs, in theory, of course, provide safe and transparent data exchange for that sort of highly sensitive data. And in theory, they could give the user or the patient a level of autonomy over their data that we might not currently have. I mean, certainly in England, if I think about it, my own health data is strewn across various state NHS, but also, you know, private people I might have seen over the years, and it's definitely not in one place. And the idea is that the metaverse could allow us to create a sort of medical passport that could be used and ported around the metaverse, and we'd have some control over it, and it might reduce fraud and also, importantly, administrative burdens on us as patients, but also doctors and insurers on accessing people's health data. Obviously, there are moral concerns potentially with monetizing health data in this way, and also obvious data protection challenges as we venture into this new world. Financial services, just to draw out a couple of interesting developments in financial services arena. First, the metaverse allowing banking customers to virtually meet and communicate with bank staff, as well as transact, invest, and purchase banking products. Now, obviously, or certainly in the UK, and I know elsewhere too, there's a bit of a theme that banks are shutting down their physical locations. Not so in the metaverse, in that many of the big names, Citi, BNP Paribas, Fidelity, JP Morgan, are investing in space and land within the metaverse to open virtual banks. And sort of linked to that, the second interesting area I wanted to talk about here is the idea that the metaverse could create opportunities for people to engage with their finances in a more visual and personal way. So, for example, sounds wacky, but in theory, you could walk around a world where your savings objectives and your pension dreams were fulfilled, and you could see firsthand what you could buy and what kind of life you could live. And the idea is that that is likely to have a more meaningful impact on how we act now than the traditional sort of education that we receive on it. Another hot topic which we would have to mention before we move on is decentralized finance. So this is the emerging financial technology based on distributed ledgers, like we talked about, that allows sort of peer-to-peer exchange of assets and money and so on, eliminating banks and financial companies and the fees that they charge. Now, that all sounds great potentially, but of course that also brings with it a level of regulation removal too. And so there's a big challenge, as many of you on the call will know today, as to how to regulate decentralized finance and ensure that it's safe from hacks and scams and so on. So that's an interesting hot topic. Media and entertainment, let's move on to that. Now, I think this is obviously one of the ones that gets most of the airtime in the general press about the metaverse, and there is obviously new stuff and exciting stuff going on. So some of the interesting developments, so virtual performances obviously create the opportunity to build or perform something fairly new to what we've seen before. There's possibilities of using an avatar representing an artist and merging it with the real artist, with a video of the artist doing something live, different artists doing different things at different times and merged together, interaction with the audience in real time. Lots of artists are doing expensive hookups with video games. This is Travis Scott in the picture here in Fortnite. So lots of exciting things in that space we're already seeing. Also, the creation of, as we mentioned before, NFTs linked to particular pieces of artwork and music is big business already, and there's quite extraordinary sums of money changing hands for some of those. And I think that the fact that some of those are selling for so much money is definitely putting pressure on artists and record labels to sort of monetize that properly, and no doubt pressure on existing artist deals with record labels as to whether NFTs were envisaged at the time they were entered into and how ownership works in light of it. There is a view that royalty collection could work much more smoothly with NFTs because of this point about things happening automatically through smart contracts and so on in the metaverse. Theme parks, interesting. A few months ago, the first virtual theme park was opened in the metaverse. Based on blockchain technology, you can enter the theme park in the same way as you would a real one, wearing your glasses, and you can purchase tickets through an NFT. VR movies actually already existed before the sort of current metaverse. There's a film called The Line, which is quite interesting and won some Emmys that some of you might have heard of, which is a short virtual reality movie where you can engage in the storyline, and as the viewer or the user, you can change the outcome of the film. Last sector to look at, advertising and retail. I think it's fair to say that the impact that the metaverse is going to have on the retail sector is still a little bit unclear. It does, though, have the potential to be pretty far-reaching and revolutionary. And I think whether or not it does have that impact is going to depend on whether the metaverse can really create a sort of virtual world that is closer to our real experience in a physical store than the internet currently is. So you can see that if a virtual store in the metaverse became a viable alternative to a physical store in a way that scrolling through your phone and clicking on a pair of jeans you want to buy isn't really yet at the moment, then potentially that's a real game changer. And definitely retailers are investing in and experimenting, I think is the right word, with the metaverse at the moment to just see what opportunities there are and to learn really from it. So lots of luxury brands are doing the NFT thing, as you've probably seen, where they connect it to a bespoke handbag or a bespoke pair of trainers, and you spend quite vast amounts of money for virtual trainers. Other brands have gone further and opened actual proper virtual stores within the metaverse. Balenciaga launched one of its recent lines solely through the metaverse in a virtual reality video game. So definitely some interesting stuff going on, but still sort of testing the waters, I think it's fair to say. So in the time that we've got left, we're going to spend it on this last slide, which is what you should be thinking about as in-house lawyers. Now, first of all, I think my message would be just to kind of get familiar with the building blocks of the metaverse and the terminology that's thrown around. Hopefully this has helped to demystify it a bit, some of it, just so that you can sort of follow the story, and as your business is considering it in the future, you can be part of and even drive those conversations. Second of all, as lawyers, I think, follow the developments in regulations, as I'm sure you would anyway, in your countries, which are definitely coming soonish, medium term maybe. And also, and this is more what this slide is about, have an awareness of some of the familiar laws that we already know that are going to be challenged by this new world. So just to go through a few of those. Data protection, first of all, an obvious one. There's going to be massive amounts of data related to transactions and interactions in the metaverse. And the whole thing really rests on that data being easily shared and interoperable between different platforms. Some of that data, as we've seen as well, is going to be really sensitive, like health data and so on. Combined with that, there's clearly already is and going to be new hacking methods to from naughty people to try and get that data. So new cybersecurity threats too. And then on top of all that, there's going to be an obvious jurisdiction issue as to which data protection rules apply. Which regulators will take action in different circumstances. And I think there's going to be quite a lot of pressure on the regulators in data privacy and data protection to give templates and guidance to what should happen and how to set the right balance between allowing users to operate within the metaverse, but also to protect their privacy. It's likely that the platforms themselves are going to have mega agreements between themselves, allocating risk and so forth. In terms of user terms, I think the traditional notice and consent model that we're all quite familiar with, whereby you consent to certain ways in which your data will be used, is going to be tested even more by the metaverse if it takes off in the way that it's predicted, in that the length of those possible notices could be utterly ridiculous. Turning to IP licensing, we've already talked about the metaverse being quite a hot area to exploit content in new ways. Definitely there's going to be some tests on the drafting of IP licenses, even basic things like whether the definition of territory covers the metaverse or not is probably going to become an issue, not just in IP licenses, but contracts generally. The rights granted is also a really interesting one. If you are, for example, a potential licensor who wants to allow some whizzy company to do something with your content in the metaverse space, then I think the message I would give would be to be very cautious not to give too much too soon, given the early stage of the metaverse. So, for example, exclusive rights to the metaverse could at this point be as dangerous as giving someone exclusive rights to the internet over your content. So think very carefully if that's what you want to do. Ditto, though, you do want to give the freedom to companies to innovate and to create and to make the most of this new potential opportunity. So there's going to be clearly some negotiations to be had there. Thinking about brand protection for a moment, I think another area of law that is adapting to life in the metaverse is trademarks. Some of you will know on this call, some may not, that the way registered trademarks work in almost every country in the world is that you have to register them for particular goods and services, and that those are classified according to groups of similar goods or similar services. So if I was registering a trademark to do clothing under that brand or footwear under that brand, I would file in class 25, which covers footwear and clothing. And that's one of the big questions, is whether the virtual trainers, to use that example, are the same as normal trainers for the purposes of your registered trademarks. There haven't really been many actual court cases testing someone enforcing a, sorry, just need a sip of tea, I'm very English. There haven't been many cases testing whether a traditional trademark registration for footwear, for example, can be enforced against someone who is infringing that image or logo or name on virtual footwear in the metaverse. Now, I'm sure that there would be a good go at doing that enforcement, but actually the guidance that's coming out from the IP officers is that really to properly protect virtual footwear, you should be filing a Class 9, which covers computer software. And not only that, but you should be crafting a specific specification that is something along the lines of computer software in the form of virtual goods, such as footwear, for example. So definitely lots of brands are spending more money, frankly, in protecting their brand in the metaverse, and clearly thinking about budgets in that sense, and trademark budgets on whether they should be making those filings before someone else does. And then you have a problem on the register, as no doubt many of you might have experienced previously. NFTs, I wanted to mention briefly. NFTs are legally speaking, very much a case of buyer beware, in my view, in that there's a lot of talk about NFT ownership as if it's an asset that you own, but it's important to think about the fact that the NFT connects to a piece of music or a painting, even, that you don't necessarily buy anything to do with that underlying piece of music or the painting itself. You don't necessarily buy the copyright in it, aside from the physical item as well. You are buying the NFT. And even then, if you're buying the NFT, interestingly, only one of the top 25 NFT providers at the moment do you actually assigns your ownership in the NFT. Most of them are licenses, even though they don't bill themselves as such. And some of them are really restrictive licenses in terms of no commercial use and selling on for profit and so on. So that's something to be live if you are buying them, but also if you are working with someone who issues them. I think the NFT terms of sale I have seen are all horrendously drafted, even for some potentially quite big companies issuing them. So there's definitely a developing position in that, if we can say it that way, as lawyers. Financial regulation isn't far from the door either, in that there's a lot of talk in many countries as to whether an NFT is a security, and therefore, of course, whether it should be regulated as such under the local legislation. And our Financial Conduct Authority is grappling with that right now, and so are other equivalent authorities around the world. Final point is just this one around merger control and competition. There's a definite theme of competition authorities getting very nervous about the hefty acquisitions that the big players are making in the metaverse, and wanting to put some stakes in the ground early on and potentially dominate something that could be very transformative for our online experience. So I think it's fair to say that any investments your business is involved in the space could well be looked at quite closely by competition authorities. That was it for me from what you should be thinking about. There's definitely a little bit of time for questions. We do have another poll though, Neve, is that right?
We do indeed. So we're super curious at this stage to see, have we kept everyone? And now, after listening to Anna, what you're thinking about in terms of your organization and the impact on your business. So let's go to poll 3 this time. So here we're going to have a look at thinking about planning for the metaverse. Which of the following most closely reflects your organization's position? So maybe you've already started operating in or planning for the metaverse. Maybe you don't consider the metaverse in any more detail for at least a year in terms of time horizon. Maybe it's a +3 years for you in terms of your perspective on when this is actually going to impact your organization. Or maybe you're still over with my cynical friends thinking that the metaverse just isn't really going to factor into our plans. So lovely to see the engagement. We'd love to get the group's collective view on this. So please do vote if you haven't already. We'll do the normal countdown. So let's go from 5, 4, 3, 2, one, giving a chance for last minute votes. It's always good. Great. Let's end and share the results. So, and I know you're going to be very curious to see what this looks like after the session. So here, interesting. So we don't plan to consider the metaverse in any more detail for at least a year. So it looks like the majority are looking at that year horizon, so 42%, with an additional 27 on a 3+ year horizon. It's also really interesting to see the 23% who are already active in this space. And actually, we did a session on this morning, and I think that aligns quite well in terms of the split we had with the morning group as well. So yes, your take on that, Anna, and as Anna said, questions, feel free to pop them into the chat, or of course you're welcome to engage directly with Anna.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I think that that aligns with my general feeling from talking to people in different sectors, is that it's not something that's being completely ignored, but everyone is treading with a little bit of caution. And if they are involved in it, it's in that kind of test mode, or perhaps conversations around the board table about what might happen in the next few years. And a lot of people are waiting to see what others in their sector do, I think, first before making any big investments. So this definitely tallies with that. Okay.
So leaving everyone to have a little think, I am going to do a quick roundup on the session. So we hope you found today useful. Leave us your take in the chat. So drop us a note, tell us what you thought. Of course, you can contact us at cxprogram@dentons.com. Equally, if you'd like the slides from today's session, also feel free to drop us a note. I do want to profile one excellent webinar that's coming up on the 24th of November, and it's all about exploring you and your team, the relationships, your personal style, how you engage and get the most from your team, as well as other stakeholders in the business. So I would encourage you, if you haven't already done so, that is a really good session coming up on the 24th of November. We also have 2 other sessions before the end of the year, the 7th of December and the 8th of December, where we'll be looking at our WOW series in conversation with Lorraine Lee, GC of Assistant Services Worldwide. And we'll also be looking at the topic of innovation, a really nice time as well, as before we head into next year, to look at creating a culture of innovation in your legal function. Okay, so Anna, any questions coming in before we close?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm now just seeing the chat. Okay, so advice on protecting digital twins, which I think generally there's some advice on protecting digital twins or NFTs. So I think that question can be interpreted in different ways. There's obviously going to need to be some quite specific software, some of which already exists, to protect the cybersecurity sort of element of protecting your NFTs and hardware wallets and so on. I think also, though, it sort of links in my mind to the question of what does it actually mean if I have bought an NFT or a digital twin, in that does it mean that someone can't create this, is prohibited from creating the same artwork or the same piece of music? And can I do anything about it if they do? And I think definitely that's, you know, a long question that could have an hour to itself. But I do think that it's quite difficult actually to, unless you have bought rights in the underlying artwork itself and the copyright of it, to do much if someone starts infringing the virtual trainers, for example, that you've paid an extortionate of money for. Now, of course, if they copy the code that makes up the NFT or the digital twin, then that's another question. But that might not practically be what you care about. It might be the more sort of tangible, in some sense, thing of the underlying artwork or media, piece of media that you're concerned about. So yeah, the value of them is definitely questionable in that sense. Just looking at some other
Another one from Alexander. Thanks, Alexander. So you mentioned jurisdictional issues with metaverse. Is it likely that the matter could be resolved by using IP address?
Yes, I mean, I think that relates to a bigger topic in my mind around, isn't this all just the same problems we faced with the internet when it came in, and we managed with that, didn't we, with a bit more legislation and sort of found new ways of working out where the bad guys were and so on. I think and I think that's definitely true, that in terms of individual bad operators, if you can find out, you know, where IP addresses are doing things, then that is definitely going to be looked at in the same way it is right now for misbehavior on the internet. I do think, though, that first of all, it might be more difficult to track that in the way that the metaverse is expected to work, and to actually be able to track things like that. But also because of the development of these intangible assets and digital assets that only exist in the virtual world, then they haven't really been created, some would argue, anywhere in particular. So there's definitely slightly more different challenges, I think, that can be faced. I'm not saying, though, that existing laws can't, with a bit of work, easily adapt to deal with it. In IP addresses and so on will definitely, I'm sure, be a part of that.
Right. Another one from Sean. Thank you, Sean. So Anna, what's your take on the FTX collapse and other recent scandals in the crypto world? And will this bleed over to the blockchain and metaverse industries in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely fair to say, isn't it, that some of the sort of heftier investments in the metaverse might be on pause around the board table right now in watching this space on the current cryptocurrency collapse and the sort of questions being raised around that. And because, as we discussed, the way that transactions will work is not dissimilar in the metaverse. I think, though, that as we've seen from the massive statistics of how much has been invested just in the first half of this year, I don't think it will put an entire end to it, and it hasn't put an entire end to it in terms of what people are investing in. But I definitely think that it is the reason for the mapping of the poll that we've just seen, in terms of only a few people really actually doing stuff right now, and many others holding back and having conversations of what they might like to do, depending on how things go in the next year or so.
Excellent. So any final questions for Anna? Okay, do leave us some feedback coming in. We'd love to hear what you thought of this session. Obviously a new topic for us in terms of this program, so do let us know whether or not you found today's session useful. I want to thank everybody for joining for us, for staying with us for the full session today. It was lovely to see so many of you stay right through and engage throughout, so very appreciative of that. And a huge thank you to Anna for a great session today, for taking on the topic with such energy and enthusiasm. So Anna, thank you for that, and for bringing your experience and insight in the area to today's session. That's it from us. We're looking forward to seeing you at the sessions over the coming weeks.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining.